again, this is 3, seminar 3 of what is and what is not. So then Empedocles and Anaxagoras, I say Empedocles in the principle of unrest, we spoke about unrest in the sense of rebellion, and then we see, with already with Parmenides, and then motion and the sphere. We'll go back to the question of the sphere.
When you use unrest, are you using the translation of the Greek word that sometimes is translated as strife?
Also, I mean, especially with, I was thinking of, in any case, Pelin, but certainly in relation to Empedocles.
I see,
okay. And love, we speak about that.
Right, okay.
And then Anaxagoras, I made up this, combination ontology, meaning that, as we will see, I mean, the question, and maybe we'll start this segment on Anaxagoras, speaking about this question of the mixture, the mingling, and so on and so forth. This combination, okay, and but maybe we start with Empedocles, but what I wanted to say is, because then the last, next time, which is the last seminar of 10, ultimately seminars, will be on especially Democritus, Leucippus and Democritus and the Sophists, that, by the way, I mean, Hegel has a great praise for for the Sophists in a very interesting. Actually, at the end of the section on Anaxagoras, right? I mean, also because we are not dealing particularly with that today, so I can say that now, which is really nice. We'll go back to this next time. But he does say, really, this is the last lines of on page 349 in the Anaxagoras section in Hegel. We see this development of the universal in which real existence goes right over to the side of consciousness, right? This is what happens, we will see with Nous, with Anaxagoras. And then he says, we will see this even more in the so much decried, worldly wisdom of the Sophists, which is interesting because, the Sophists are usually seen as problematic in that negative sense, but but in any case, what I want to say, I mean, also to frame this, and that maybe after Heraclitus and Parmenides especially, we see appreciate even more the fact that Heraclitus and Parmenides are really the central moments in Presocratic philosophy. I mean, of course, there is much anticipation in the previous philosophers, starting with the Venetian school, but now we see this even more clearly, right? Because in a sense, Empedocles and Anaxagoras provide answers, in a sense, to Parmenides especially, but we see both, Heraclitus and Parmenides being engaged in many ways by Empedocles and Anaxagoras, and then, of course, the atomists as well. And but it is especially Parmenides, I believe, who is always present in both, and especially in Anaxagoras. So then, let me begin maybe by because I said that last time that Hegel has a kind of reductive and perhaps unfair, right? He gives an unfair treatment of Empedocles. I mean, he says Empedocles is not very interesting, right? A magician, a sorcerer, and so on and so forth. Patricia Kurtz says that he was a very flamboyant person, for sure. Empedocles from what today is Agrigento, Acragas, in Sicily, who was certainly a strange character. But there is something very important. I want to start with that section in that passage in Hegel, where he speaks about he highlights the importance of the synthesis, which is again the strife and love kind of movement, the synthesis which he credits Empedocles with having established this. Actually, this is on page 313 in Hegel, toward the end of the page, the bottom of the page, maybe line 6, right, where from the bottom, where he says Empedocles' conception of synthesis holds good to the present day. Okay, I just want to call attention to that. But then the passage that I really wanted to start with, which is perhaps the most important about, actually this is a fragment that by Empedocles that Hegel is quoting, right? So, but I want to read this in the second half of page 315. And the passage by Empedocles, his poem, right, on nature, is there is no such thing as nature, which is quite something, right? Only a combination. So the question of combination that we will see in Anaxagoras is already, however, present in Empedocles, but a combination and separation, right, of what is combined. It is merely called nature by man. Okay, and so I want to use this also as a pointer for the reading tonight, maybe of both Empedocles and Anaxagoras, the idea that there is this combination and recombination, right, strife, precisely, and love in Empedocles. And all these things, however, then we will see how they were anticipated in many ways by the previous philosophers, right? For example, Anaximenes did speak about, right, these forces as well, right, of rarity and condensation, right, and so on. And then also the question of this combination and recombination. Maybe, what I want to do is that then we look at this in a more systematic fashion, but I want to make right now a connection between this and a passage in Anaxagoras. But this time maybe I go to the Bruno. No, even Hegel, page 346. So this is again toward the end of the middle paragraph on page 346. I read from 10 lines from the end, but it is just is one-sided to say that the plant, for instance, is only in and for itself, only end to itself, only shut up within itself and going back to itself. Then we will put this in a better context soon. For each idea, Hegel is saying, is a circle which is complete in itself, but whose completion is likewise a passing into another circle. It is a vortex whose middle point, that into which it returns, is found directly in the periphery of a higher circle which swallows it up. Thus, for the first time, we reach the determination of an end in the world which is immanent within it. Okay, so he's speaking about the concept of the end in interesting ways. We will go back to this, but I wanted to, point out, in a sense, the continuity also in relation to this ontology of this combination ontology, and this idea of the threshold, really, that we are looking at, in relation to Hegel's comment on about Anaxagoras here, right? The idea of the threshold and also the immanent potential, right? That there is this constant movement and therefore this vortex, right? And this, he says vortex, but this principle of unrest. Okay, so I just wanted to do, but then we'll go back to in a more systematic way, maybe to certain Empedocles and later Anaxagoras. Okay, but I don't know if that makes sense. There is this continuity, and in a sense, both moments have to do with the question of Parmenides, right? In a sense, answering Parmenides, but also giving a better sense of what, and we saw this last time, that actually we spoke twice, right, about Parmenides at least, the fact that this sphere cannot, although unmoving, as Parmenides himself says, cannot be deprived completely of some type of motion ultimately, although this is what Zeno, then we go back to Zeno as well, because Anaxagoras has some important connections to Zeno, but it is the potential, right? We saw in speaking about Parmenides that what is, right, is what can be, right? And so there must be some type of unrest, whether it's within, but also, I mean, again, the question that Tony, you were saying the other day, you know, there is this expansion. And so that is the idea that we see in this passage by Hegel on Anaxagoras, this constant kind of a movement forward, this expansion and this, therefore, threshold, right? Okay. So in any case, maybe we start with Hegel's reading of Democritus, Empedocles, and again, I mentioned that for him it's right, Empedocles is not, he says that on page 313, not very interesting, because in the middle of the page he says Empedocles is more poetic than definitely philosophical. He is not very interesting, and much cannot be made of his philosophy, which is not the same way in which Burnet, right, looks at Empedocles. And certainly we can say, you know, we can take issue with what Hegel is saying right here, because, you know, what does it mean to say that it is that we find more poetry than philosophy in Empedocles, right? I mean, well, we know Heidegger, no, the importance that Heidegger gives to poetry, but even I'm quoting from memory now, but Deleuze and Guattari had that wonderful sentence statement in, I believe, What is Philosophy, where they say something like, I think it's the literal, that poetry is closer to the heart of philosophy than philosophy itself, right? Something like that.
The logical order or the rational.
Right.
So it's the poetic philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. And of course, we saw that not only the Parmenides, right, in poetical form, but also, you know, what we find in Heraclitus and in Anaximenes is not far from whatever we can. So in any case, he has this very strong, you know, he makes this very strong statement, negative statement about.
Yes. Which, you know, it's a complicated argument about the poetics that Plato argues that since poetry still is within the mimetic,
right,
it does not really seek the dialectical truth, so it's outside of, you know, basically philosophical order of thinking, and that's the reason that they're ostracized. However, in the third book, there's certain kinds of poetry in the Republic that's allowed. Right? He actually has a thing about the epic stories, how you rewrite poetry to the rational order. Yes. So this is a very complicated matter, you know, in a sense where it's just not so simple as you know, poetry versus philosophy and vice versa.
No, absolutely. So I mean, and certainly also there is.
Sorry, I'm just going to say it's a both and, and either or that most people have kind of brought up over the years.
Right.
You know,
but also the fact that then. Hegel himself stresses the importance of the moment of synthesis, but that is typically poetic,
coming together.
That, if we think about Vico, right, everything is in the new science, poetic metaphysics, poetic logic, and so on and so forth, and everything is precisely synthetic, if you will, more than analytical in character, right? The synthesis is always important in that sense.
Right.
Which
comes from a god aesthetis, you know, which is the position. The synthesis is really the coming together of the positions, you know, and really going back to the god. It's a feminine moment in the history of philosophy.
Yes.
It's another aspect. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Okay. Yeah. So in any case, then that's the page also where he goes into the importance that he says about the synthesis, but you know, there are relations also that he speaks about, you know, between there is a relation between Democritus, Empedocles and Parmenides and Zeno. And then on page 314 he goes into the question of precisely friendship, he says, and strife, or love and strife, that he says they are universal. And the elements, of course. I mean, the question of the elements is relatively new now, no? With Empedocles, and then, as we will see, Anaxagoras. So we read the important passage on the fragment, you know, on page 315, that nature is ultimately, you know, what people call it, you know, this question of, but it is not, otherwise it's a combination, recombination, and also, you know, the fact that certainly it is true that, to go back to the question of poetry, that the heart is more important than other things, than reason, or in Empedocles. But if so that we also see the continuity, and I mean, there is another, maybe the most important to my mind, fragment in the Anaxagoras segment that also relates to this, right? Because just like we see that nature is called into question as a concept, right, in this way. So there is that passage in which Anaxagoras rephrases, right? It's maybe a linguistic note, right? Comment. He says the Greeks have been mistaken in thinking of coming to be and passing away. In reality, everything is a matter of mingling, mixing together, combination, and so on. So he's not saying, of course, that because no Presocratic philosopher, right, so far has said that things come from nothing and go back to nothing. I mean, even the first class that we had, and I saw the cycle that we already find with Thales, with Aristotle's account of Thales, and then certainly, right, the Anaximander fragment, to which we are going to go back in a moment. There too, it is clear that they are not so distant from what Anaxagoras says. Anaxagoras now makes this more explicit, right? He says, instead of speaking, let me get one of, well, we had the fragments in all these books, but let me get to the curve, maybe, or even the Bruno also has a nice. Okay, so this is the way curved, the rendering by Patricia Kerr on page 105, fragment 17. The Greeks do not think correctly about, but it's not a matter of thinking really. It's a question of you know, the phrasing that he's taking issue with, right? Correctly about coming to be and passing away. For nothing comes to be or passes away, but is mixed together and dissociated from the things that are. And thus they would be correct to call, right, coming to be, mixing together and passing away, dissociating, when it's right here, right? Yeah, which is okay. I mean, no, but again, if we go back to Anaximander, we see that, right, I mean, the things that are, right, perish into those from which they come to be, right? I mean, so again, because they have to pay penalty and retribution for their injustice, but Anaximander too, of course, he doesn't say the things that are come out of, because nothing comes out of nothing, from nothing, nothing goes back into nothing. They perish into the things from which they came to be. Now, these things change, the things from which, right, then now we had these elements, now with certainly the four elements in Empedocles, we have the homo emerai, right? I mean, in the homogeneous matter stuff in Anaxagoras, instead of the apeiron, so this is not to say that they say that there is no change. Certainly there is a more explicit way of, right, I mean, there is some type of unfolding at the conceptual as well as the linguistic level. But I believe that the remark, because he's taking issue with the Greeks, right, Anaxagoras, the Greek philosophers who come before him, so certainly that's what he's saying, right, that they shouldn't call it coming to be and passing away, but use a different type of language. I mean, we can speak about this, but I thought that this was really important because, again, this is a very accurate, of course, description of what Presocratic philosophy is, but it is also important to say that, again, he's not saying something completely new. I mean, to my mind, I mean, I think that from what I saw, for example, that the authors that we are considering, the commentators on the Presocratics, that they don't stress that strongly enough. It is as if Anaxagoras is saying something completely different, right? Okay, so this is the way Bruno speaks of this. So they would be right to call coming into being mixture and passing away separation. Okay. So no, I don't know if, but that is important, right? I mean, okay. So okay, we'll go back to this again later, but to go back to Democritus again, to Empedocles, evidently I want to do Democritus soon, but on page 316. This is actually Aristotle's criticism of Empedocles, because Aristotle also, like Hegel, is criticizing him, whereas again there is this praise for Anaxagoras, as we will see. But this is when he says in the middle of page 316, Hegel says these are the principal points in Empedocles' philosophy. And he says, I will quote the remarks that Aristotle, Metaphysics 1:4, makes in this regard. If we wish to follow this up and do so in accordance with the understanding, not merely stumbling over it like Empedocles, we should say that friendship is the principle of good and strife the principle of evil, and so on. And then he says, Hegel says that we find this, brought to the level of the notion with Anaxagoras, of course, because then in Anaxagoras we had the nous as regulating everything rather than,
what page was that?
Oh, this was page 316, the middle of page 316. So in any case, I mean, there is this kind of reductive, in a sense, reading that we have in Hegel, whereas in Burnett there is a very long section on Empedocles, and he tells us about his life a little, just like Hegel also does, but and it is Burnett that says on page 201. Well, first he says that probably Gorgias, but it's not clear, Gorgias the sophist was a disciple of Empedocles. But then at the end of page 201, the bottom of it, he says that, of course, for Empedocles, it also held that we breathe through all the pores of the body, and that the act of respiration is closely connected with the motion of the blood, right? The heart, he says, Burnett, not the brain, was regarded as the organ of consciousness. And there is that beautiful moment in one of Empedocles' fragments, right, where he says that the heart around the blood, right, the heart about the blood is human thought, or for humans is thought, right? That's very, it's toward the end of at least the new edition of the Curve. Is that's a beautiful, that's very poetic, but again, you know, what's wrong with that? Actually, a friend of mine from San Francisco, Sarah Menefit, you know her too, she wrote this wonderful book of poems called The Blood About the Heart, with reference to the title, of reference to Empedocles, that I translated into Italian.
And Shakespeare has a line
about this.
I think, yeah, the blood of
right.
I think he uses a very similar phrase.
Right. Okay. So, and this is in any case just but again we had the fragments here too, but it is toward the end of the fragments. Let me find it in the Burnett maybe. The Burnett is fragment 105 on page 220. We all have that, right? And just the end of this fragment precisely reads, for the blood round the heart is the thought of a man. Okay? Plural. So again, yeah, it is true there is this important moment, which is again perhaps more poetic, but and also what I want to say is that in Burnett that he always seems to have this interest in the question of the senses and the body. Right? There is now this, of course, I mean, he says here that, you know, he highlights, stresses the importance of the heart in Empedocles, but also then later he says how the Empedocles' emphasis on the body, the senses, is very important in relation to Parmenides, again, as an answer, in a sense, to the question of, and he already said that the sphere, I don't know if you remember, we can find in Burnett, in Parmenides is body, he says, right? And I remember some weeks ago we were speaking about the question of the senses, right, in relation to, and we mentioned Marx, right, as well from the philosophical, no? And economic manuscripts, the emancipation of the senses becoming theoreticians in their immediate praxis. And in a sense, what Burnett says about Empedocles, I mean, seems that is the direction in Empedocles of giving the senses this capacity, right? I mean, that's what I thought. Actually, you know, then after we spoke about that, because we were all of us quoting from memory, I copied the wonderful passage by Marx. Maybe I can share that as well. Remember from, and then we see what Burnett says about the importance of the senses in Empedocles. But okay, this is I don't know why I didn't find it, but I know it's here.
No, it's
Oh,
all
no,
right.
it's here. No,
Sorry.
it was. Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
This is
Don't
the
worry
Marx
about
book?
it. Yeah.
Okay, in any case,
Edition
this
one?
is what Marx. I mean,
1840.
You know, the 1844 manuscript.
right,
yeah.
right,
I mean,
right.
I mean, I would have reproduced it. So,
right from the section called private property
Yes.
and communism,
Communism,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And he says, I mean, it's wonderful, not only because of what he says about the senses, the emancipation of the senses, but also the beginning. But he says private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is ours only if we have it, if it exists for us as a capital or is immediately possessed by us, eaten, drunk, worn, lived in, etc. In short, used. But private property grasps all these immediate forms of possession only as means of living, and the life they serve in the life of private property, labor, and capitalization. Hence, all the physical and spiritual senses have been replaced by the simple alienation of them all, the sense of having. The overcoming of private property means, therefore, the complete emancipation of all human senses and aptitudes, which is wonderful also because, as everybody knows, Marx usually doesn't speak about what communism will be, but this is really, the philosophical status of communism. Not what people think about communism or socialism today, as we are seeing in relation to
more human.
The campaign and
this is never employed as a moment in terms of socialism or communism today. That's the furthest thing from the people's minds.
But this is what should
as you well know, right?
This should be brought up because
of course,
if I may remark with
I'm going to start with this Thursday. I'm going to start this Thursday with this.
Okay, I will continue the reading, but that's because when people see what they say, these immense stupidities, like the guy who's not Chris Matthews, was his name?
Chris Matthews?
Right.
About the socialists being executions in Central Park?
Right. And all these things, and then also this general fear that...
He said that, what did he say?
He said that if Bernie...
Well, he
imagine that there will be executions, public executions in Central Park of all places.
This is what Fidel Castro he uses Castro as his model.
So maybe the best thing about his campaign is he's making people appear as they really were the whole time, They come out and say these things and we say they were the whole time.
Well, it's interesting because he's yielding the symptomatic, there's no question about that from a lot of people. Right. The interesting thing is that Chris Hayes, who is a nation left liberal in a way, kind of went after Chris Matthews on the TV program. So it was a roundtable. It wasn't just Chris Matthews and his show. Chris Hayes was there engaging him. Now Rachel Maddow is going to take the easiest way out. That piece of work. Right. Anyway.
But this is it is a widespread misconception, that this socially, that some work has been done on this, but we should continue because again, if anything, one would say in a quick way. So what's wrong with the socialist or whatever communist? But the question is, should be argued philosophically how this is not simply what people usually.
Well, the way to argue it is start talking about the great health of the future. Through this emancipation of the senses, and we have not even begun to smell, to see, etc. This is really the way that this really needs to be proposed. In medical terms about health versus that of the sickness of private property and what it's produced and where we've gone,
Absolutely, because this, then I'll continue the second part.
I'm sorry.
But the first part where I read about private property, the alienation of the senses, and the importance of having rather than being, that's precisely what we understand, not only with the word capitalism and neo-liberal, but also whatever people mean by Americanism. It will be, certainly it is an ideology, but it's certainly not a philosophical position, right? So this opposition this fictional, right, polarization, opposition between right, socialism, communism on the one hand, and Americanism makes no sense whatsoever. So it should be understood that, of course, socialism can be constructed, communism here. I mean, it is not antithetical to whatever we understand by American. I mean, why, it is as if they were, really,
well, this goes back to the historical parameters of American exceptionalism, which starts at the turn of the 20th century with Stead was his name, who was a friend of John Jacob Astor. He died on the Titanic, by the way.
Right.
Yeah. And he wrote a book called American Exceptionalism,
right,
1902.
Yeah. We went down with the ship.
We went down with the ship with John Jacob Astor IV.
See,
the
there's
fur
some
trader.
poetry there.
The fur trader. So the American exceptionalism went to the ocean, man. They didn't rearrange the deck chairs, as they used to say. Working under capitalism is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Right, but on the other hand, not in terms of exceptionalism, but Gramsci speaks of Americanism.
Who?
Gramsci.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, the Americanization of the world, which became the moment after World War I, too, which is very active, which is complete, I mean, in a way.
Right, and but which is not necessarily again antithetical to what it means to build.
I mean, the good selling
we were
point.
speaking about the utopian dimension the other day again. So, but this should be done because otherwise we are left with these platitudes that not only
platitudes. I mean, complete misinformation, complete fake,
right? Exactly.
Complete. I mean, massive distortion.
Distortion. Right, because it was said they don't need
that'd be powerful.
In reality, they do a lot of damage. Right.
Exactly. And another thing to remember, to tell young people, Marx is 26 years old when he wrote that. He's 26. This is not the mature Marx. This is Marx at 26 years old when he's writing the Paris manuscripts. That were discovered in 1932.
So could you start from the section about a couple lines up?
Hence all the physical and spiritual senses, maybe from this, have been replaced, by the simple alienation of them all. The sense of having, he says that's another sense. The sense of having replaces all the other, the spiritual and physical senses, right? Then there is some text that I didn't copy, and then he says the overcoming of private property means therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and aptitudes. But it means this emancipation precisely because these senses and aptitudes have become human, both subjectively and objectively. The eye has become a human eye, just as its object has become a social human object derived from and for man. The senses have therefore become theoreticians immediately in their praxis. Wonderful, eh? Need or satisfaction have thus lost their egoistic nature, and nature has lost its mere utility by use becoming human use. Again, this is
anti-utilitarian.
Also utilitarian and very much, because then we spoke about this in the context of a Presocratic philosophy, and tonight. Last time it was in the context of Heraclitus that this came up, but with Empedocles tonight. But then we put that in the context right now of not the political discourse, it's not political, right? I don't know what type of discourse is that.
Well, it's propagandistic, and propagandistic.
Exactly.
That's what's really happening here.
Right, but it is important because the sense of having, and we can talk more about it. I mean, it's not that, again, he's not against use, but use is, of course, very important, but it has to become human use. I mean, again, it's not the alienation of all the other senses and their replacement by the sense of having, which is quite something. I mean, this is certainly a dystopian moment. It is a moment of a social pathology that we precisely are living through, right? Which is right, reinforced by all these people saying all these, you know, I don't know, outrageous things. I mean, they make not these statements that, as you say, propagandistic. I mean, they mean nothing, and yet, you know, they get the proper attention, the attention they want. That's the problem. So
well, I mean, he's got a huge audience. I mean, this is a major. Chris Matthews has a huge audience,
yeah,
and it's also done in the context of someone who's an ex-Jimmy Carter employee, speechwriter, as well as you know, a person who worked in the Congress, who became a media, you know, commentator on politics. He's anti, quote unquote, neocon, anti, you know, Reagan years, but at the same time, he's the worst form of the Cold War liberal, you know, playing out right now, and he's the pit bull that's being unleashed to kind of destroy, you know, any possibility of Bernie Sanders having any currency at this point. So,
and this, of course,
or the real discussion about socialism. See, again, the censorship is happening before there is a discussion. It's pre-censorship.
And certainly this in the context of this other discourse, which is not a discourse, I mean, Trump and so on, you know, all the things he says and so, you know, I mean, it's amazing because we have really, I don't know how to describe this, but we have lost completely any type of right.
Yeah, but I mean, this was going on with Hillary and Sanders as well, and Hillary and Trump in 2016. This kind of discourse of you know, kind of distortion was massive.
Sanders, but he is actually, he represents a kind of difference, which is not only a difference in of a degree, but of a kind, really.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
I don't remember.
A kinder and more gentle imperialism.
But in the Hillary campaign, I don't remember them really attacking democratic socialism so much.
No, but this is being positioned because of the possibility of them
actually winning.
I mean, they're beginning to see it as a threat. It's just like Marx in the beginning of the manifesto.
Right.
Communism is now recognized. The specter that's haunting Europe, it becomes recognized.
Right.
So all the armies are against it. Yeah, so it's much more active as a possibility. Sanders was not really considered that serious in terms of the national event. They already knew they could do it.
Right.
Now everybody's on to the theft, so they have to do it at a different level.
I
hear what you're saying, though. I just think it's good to have the historical
we all
narrative.
know that when 2 days ago the Communist Manifesto was mentioned, right, or quoted even at the during the Oscars, right?
Well, they didn't quote it, they paraphrased.
Workers of right. But in any case, yes. But the point is that I was thinking, you know.
And the worst part of that award was it was a Michelle Obama and Obama production, and there was a much better film that I saw that I recommend deeply, Honeyland, which is much more interesting, about the beekeeper in Macedonia. It's an absolutely beautiful film. Absolutely beautiful. Honeyland, about a North Macedonian beekeeper, a woman who is completely isolated and is basically taken out by the new neoliberal order. You can see how brutal it really is with this very small, you know, beekeeper in Macedonia. And much more interesting than American Factory where they went on. This is absolutely beautiful. The cinematography is great. And you want to talk about, vis-a-vis your book, Humanity, you know, your last book, Humanity, Enemy, right? This is a very beautiful portrait of human dignity. I mean, really, to me, I was really touched by this character and the way it was positioned. So I recommend, it's called Honeyland. It's about a beekeeper in, I think it's playing at the Quad Theater on 13th Street, right off of 6th Avenue. And I mean, it's magnificent. It's really magnificent. Yeah, and the spacing is great. Beautiful landscapes, the bees, and you know, she gets into it with the competition from the gypsies, from the nomads, and how they start to steal from her hives, and what she's left with, etc. So I mean, I know you're bringing it up, how it's quoted, but you know, see, the quote would have been much more interesting had they said, and I want to mention Honeyland too, where this goes to the extremes of neoliberalism. Yeah, but I hear
know,
you.
but right, important.
Yeah,
And I agree,
sure,
this is
sure,
important. But
sure.
the thing that I was saying, especially, was in relation to, say, the philosophical dimension that we have certainly
Right,
lost for
right,
a
sure.
long time. But
Sure.
that say, I was thinking the other day, Machiavelli, in The Prince, says famously that the prince doesn't get to have all the virtues and qualities of that makes a prince apparently good and worthy of, but he must appear, he must seem to have them, right?
Right, sure.
But we live in a world today in which they don't even bother with the question of assimilation and dissimulation. They just, they just come up the way they are, and there is no dissimulation anymore. That made, at least.
Well, there is a dissimulation because it's probably much worse behind the scenes than it is what we're seeing. Just think about how bad the decisions are, what's really going on, and what we're going to be hearing about the courts, what we're going to be hearing about environmental, deregulation. I mean, we're hearing about it, but what effect will it have on us? That's another thing. Yeah.
But certainly there is a number now of very outspoken, arrogant, violent world leaders, so-called, who don't even bother with the question of hiding, the way they come, through. Forth or whatever. So that's already interesting. That's a problem because evidently the times allow this more than perhaps in the past. Right? There was some type of requirement.
You had Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco all in one dose too. With armies and with
yes, but it seems to be a more it seems to be
I agree.
more general also because
yes,
this happens today in the context. It doesn't have to happen in the context precisely of the authoritarian and totalitarian, because that's the self-description of the fascist regime, totalitarian. No, in whatever we continue calling democracies, right? So that's even more, if you will, troubling, right? In a sense.
But I do think, on the other hand, you have to take into account that state authoritarian capitalism in China. Look what they can do in terms of building hospitals in 6 or 7 days.
You mean in Wuhan?
Yeah. Just think about this. How fast that production machine is really working, that they can actually put together a hospital in 7 days. How long this would take in the United States or in more, the so-called advanced countries, which were not advanced. That's another thing. Yeah. I'm not saying that China's a model, but it does show you what the authoritarian capitalism is capable of. Yeah.
Right. Okay, but in any case, this I think that's important too. Again, in relation to the recuperation of this, what one can call a philosophical understanding of the senses, precisely because Marx speaks of the senses as being theoreticians in their immediate praxis, right? Which is quite something. We could speak a long time about the meaning of this as well, but it is,
Yeah. Do you think? I personally think he's trying to extend Feuerbachian sensuous materialism into his own thing, and he's becoming more and more adept at understanding capital and property. He's going beyond Feuerbach, but Feuerbach's the first to bring back the sensuous materialism, in some ways.
Right.
Just through the senses, it's an abstraction. It's not connected, if you will, to being blocked by private property and how stupid we've become, as you said.
Right. And certainly because you say Feuerbach, then of course his criticism of perhaps correction of the materialism even in Feuerbach is in the thesis on Feuerbach is precisely this highlighting also the importance of course the problematic concept of subjectivity, or whatever important for us, right? But certainly it was important in the side of doing poiesis, praxis, right? Yeah.
Right.
So, but in any case, again, this is of course, either, no, it's even a digression at this point. It's not.
Well, we're speaking to each
Yeah,
other
no,
in a certain way.
Huh?
We're speaking to each other. We
Yeah,
know,
yeah, exactly.
we know
I mean,
this
yeah, no,
very well.
when I say that,
You know, in a
that's
sense. I mean, it's just
yeah.
like my experience at Brooklyn College.
Right.
Colin Kaepernick came up, you know, as a model, and why it was not, you know, talked about at the Super Bowl, and how he's been ostracized, and the racial component, you know, et cetera. And then one kid raised his hand and said, well, didn't he quote Fidel Castro? You know, like this is a bad thing. So, of course, I had to get into that Fidel Castro was an excellent baseball player and also, you know, has produced great athletes for the United States, you know, for the baseball teams and et cetera. And how do you get this, that Castro is especially a bad person, you know? I mean, why do you associate that with Kaepernick, and that he actually would quote someone like Castro for a reason, and why not we try to take this context? But it just goes to show you the element what we're dealing with in the last 30, 40 years. There's just massive brainwashing and massive conditioning into this that people have no idea.
Yeah, that's why, because you know, to go back to what you were saying before, of course, I mean, at the time around World War II, I mean, it was terrible, scary and so on. But in a sense, you know, to use maybe Heideggerian language, maybe we are closer to the danger, whatever the type of danger might be. Not that we were not close, of course. It's
I see what you're
saying. The atomic bombing, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we are getting closer, in a sense, to some type of danger, including now the question of the environment and so on and so forth, which is really, you know, greater than most, as we know, than most people think. So, I mean, we better, you know, and of course, education is an important moment of contribution, trying to contribute to correct all this, but it might be too late. I mean, we live as if nothing is or has happened, but it is really, right, we are fast, moving very fast towards something, right, I mean, which is, no? I mean, again...
Potentially, I mean, maybe, so it's hard to say, right? It seems like it's just managing symptoms of the crisis.
Yeah, I mean,
the crisis is a sort of constant,
I think what you
approaching, evolving thing, right? So we're just managing the various moments along that path, and it's a matter of kind of
I think
doing
that
in a careful way. Yeah.
You had a very good concept through Leibniz on contingency. I would say what's really going on right now is contingency management. And this is really what's happening in the world, is this kind of risk management, you know, and looking where rewards are, but at the same time, it's a very, 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 you know, thin balance that's being tried to kept going. Yes, I understand that the ecological is completely, the ecosystems are completely out of balance, and we're finished. We're finished. I mean, you know, there's no question in my mind about that. I mean, you know, in a sense, I mean, mitigation isn't going to do it. Changing the Environmental Protection Agency may give us a little more time to breathe, but, you know, without a complete revolutionary overhaul of the fossil fuel industry, we don't have a chance. You know, the petrochemical, look how hard DuPont fights back, you know, on this thing. The water, you know, if you see a movie like Dark Water.
They'd have to completely stop. We have to stop everything.
Absolutely,
In fact, global emissions in the first year of the financial crisis were significantly lower because productivity, you know, and economic production was down. So that just goes to show you how deeply entwined these two things are, right? That's
absolutely. And so, but for all this, again, you know, because of course the question of the danger and the risk, but the question is, we were speaking about this maybe last time or the time before that. I mean, a radical change in thinking, first of all, right? I mean, we spoke.
Well, the Kantian moment is very important. The Kantian moment is very important. The kind of revolutionary in thinking is necessary, you know, alongside or even before the economic and political, you know, revolution. And this is always a problem we face.
There is no action without theory, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but in this, in a sense, is also what we see in a sense. I mean, not thinking like abstract logic. I mean, what we see now, not Marx with the question of the senses being theoreticians and so on. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if we want to go back to the Presocratics as well, because
No, well, yes, of course. You started the digression. I'm not at fault tonight.
No.
I can be, but.
Certainly this is about the contemporary relevance.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it is. No, it's very contemporary.
Yeah.
And then why Heidegger in some ways pointed this way for the way out. I mean, I think this is
Completely.
it. I mean, in a way, where Heidegger is pointing,
Right.
this is the way out. I mean, the philosophical order, as you were pointing out earlier, through Plato and Aristotle and systematic philosophy is not the way out.
Right.
There's no question about it.
Precisely speaking about the question of poetry,
Yeah.
it is right. I mean, the danger is right. Precisely is what the poets are.
Right.
He says closer. to
Well,
when
he
the
used to say they named the
beast
holy.
and
He had a religious kind of, the poets named the holy,
Mhm.
as
Yeah,
Heidegger,
yeah.
you know, in some ways. But holy
Yeah,
in
but
the
it
German
is
sense,
the idea of
wholeness as well.
you know, whatever, you know, turning
Right.
away, he would
Right.
say, and so on and so forth. But the question is, it is true that we need, and that's what we do in, of course, a certain type of education. We need to start thinking differently. I mean, of course, there is a
course.
long tradition. As we see, we go back to the Presocratics, and we already see that the difference in thinking is there. I mean, so much for contingency and maybe the possible and parallel worlds, or the utopia that we saw the other day. It's already there, blocked from coming about. It is already there. And by the way, speaking also in the context of the philosophy of Parmenides, right, there is this sense of eternity of things. So these possible things, these possibilities, this contingency are already there. Have always been there. But the question is to go back somehow to not to go back in the sense of of course going back in the negative repressed
nostalgia. The Luddite approach to philosophy is not going to work.
Right.
But that's not what he wanted
Right,
either.
no, of course
But
not.
I wanted to say that actually when we speak about Empedocles and Anaxagoras, even in relation to Parmenides, there is maybe also to link this back to what we were saying about Marx. There is there too already a passage from perhaps a more objective type of ontology, metaphysics, into, as Hegel also says, because he always highlights the importance of the notion, and certainly with nous in Anaxagoras, but already with Empedocles, and the sense is this more kind of subjective dimension of a different type of ontology that includes also more the subjective side of what Hegel also speaks of in terms of consciousness, right? So there is this movement, this passage from what we saw before in relation to now. And actually, good night also, right? The heart, not the brain, was regarded as the organ of consciousness, right? In Empedocles.
And Pascal.
And Pascal, of course. Yes. Absolutely. Okay, so, but I wanted to go maybe to some of that, because the fragments, again, they're given by Burnett, by Kurt, but on page 205, there is this, there are some others that we want to touch on, but fragment 4, for example, on page 205, is interesting also because there is a relation, right, by implication to Parmenides, right, where then I think that on page 227, a section called Empedocles and Parmenides, then the comment by Burnett, he says that as well. Okay, the fragment reads on page 205, but oh yes, gods, turn aside from my tongue the madness of those men, and those men would be including certainly Parmenides, right, on page 227. Empedocles says, at the very outset of his poem, Empedocles speaks angrily of those who profess to have found the whole, right? And he even calls this madness, right? No doubt, Burnett says he's thinking of Parmenides. And then a few lines below, so I'm reading both from page 205 and page 227, because then 227 is the comments that Bruno did. A few lines below, because he says, Empedocles, I want to only listen to what is clear, and so on, which is interesting in the way in which it is clear. And Bruno says, and this means that we must not, like Parmenides, reject the existence of the senses. Right, so it is by actually employing, by not even becoming the body, the senses, that we actually get to what is clear, and not by rejecting that the way Parmenides evidently suggests. Of course, I mean, in Parmenides also there is, Brunet himself says, this importance, emphasis on the body. And then he says in the second paragraph on page 227, it is often said that this system was an attempt to mediate between Parmenides and Heraclitus. It is not easy, however, to find any trace of a Heraclitean doctrine in it. In the Empedocles, although there is also even the idea of not strife and love, and it would be truer to say that it aimed at mediating between Eleaticism, the school of Elea, right, and the senses. Okay, so again, the importance of the senses in Empedocles, but of course, Heraclitus also, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then I skip a few lines. He speaks about the question of the indestructibility of what is a sphere, and I skip maybe 6-7 lines. Then he says, given, he mentions the immovable plenum that we already saw. Given the sphere of Parmenides, he seems to have said, how are we to get from it to the world we know? Right? He says that seems to be the question in Empedocles. Very interesting. How are we to introduce motion into the immovable plenum, right? Which I think that this is what we were looking at, not last time with Pelin, with unrest, and today that's why also I say Empedocles, the principle of unrest and the motion and the sphere. You have the sphere, but this sphere needs also this moment, which again we saw that it is not unthinkable that in Parmenides we already had that, because because of the question of the potential, right? Although then it seems that Zeno denies all that and draws the implications and the conclusions to the absurd. But in reality, in Zeno 2, then we saw that there is the moment of, the groundlessness in terms of space, place, and so on. So there must be some type of motion even when we seem to have reached the stage of the immovable and the motionless. Now, Parmenides, and this is because we already saw that, he has this take on Parmenides anyway. Parmenides need not have denied the possibility of motion within the sphere, though he was bound to deny all motion of the sphere itself, which I am not sure that this is actually the case. Also, Tony, what you were saying the other day, it's precise, motion within the sphere, but not motion of the sphere itself. But again, I don't know. Because we have what we saw the other day, logically and metaphysically, the big problem of, the limits. If the sphere is understood as finite, then the question arises by itself. What's there beyond this finitude? What's there beyond the limits of the finite? And so, right, apparently Parmenides not only...
Werner Heisenberg. Werner Heisenberg.
Right, we spoke about that in the terminal simply, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right, but you wanted to continue.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's an important thing, though, because Heisenberg actually wrote a book on the Greeks, on the Presocratics. Yeah, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw it. Yeah. Okay. And you also wanted to, from Nancy, you wanted
yeah, maybe, but it seems like it has more to do, maybe
What is
less
this?
to do with motion.
Motion?
The Jean.
Nancy, okay.
And the sphere, more to do with. No, maybe I'll just read it and we'll see.
Yes.
Going on about being does not pre-exist. It seems okay. Here it is. Ever since Parmenides, one of philosophy's peculiarities has been that it has been unfolding this unique proposition in all of its senses. This proposition proposes nothing but the placement and disposition of existence. It is its plural singularity. Unfolding this proposition, then, is the only thing philosophy has to do.
That's what you read the other day,
right?
Yeah. So also the question of the threshold and therefore the constant opening up of something new. I mean, of course, that's expansion and so on. And so
right.
Yeah, which is the indeterminacy, because that too. I mean, you say Heisenberg. But I'm not sure. I was about to say this last time. I didn't, and then I didn't check. I want to check. But is it possible that Heisenberg and Severino had some kind of correspondence, or
With whom? I'm sorry.
with Severino?
That I don't know.
You don't
I
know?
don't know.
I want to check that.
I don't know.
I heard that.
Possibly.
Yeah. Some type of dialogue. Which
No,
is
I mean,
interesting
Heisenberg
because-
was never anathema to philosophers. He wanted discussion.
Right,
Yeah,
because
I mean, they really have,
on the
yes,
Presocratics,
exactly.
that. Okay.
I mean, it's a great entry point into the relationship of physics and philosophy. Wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the question in any case, I mean, regardless of who then says what, the question is, and that would be what Hegel says,
Right.
it's the logic within reality, of the thing, and not simply of the word. The question is that it is not possible to understand this what is otherwise, right? Because as we saw, what is not, if there is an end to what is that there cannot be, then that would be the beginning of what is not. And that is a logical, not only a logical contradiction in the sense of the formalities of logic, it would be a logical impossibility, right? Precisely because being is what is not and cannot be. It's impossible, right? Nothing is impossible. Nothing is impossible. I don't know if we said this in this class, but I say when I teach the Presocratics, I don't know if you noticed, some years ago, you say Adidas, the brand,
Adidas.
They get this Adidas, ad, right? Nothing is impossible, right? Which is interesting because I always know
The shoe?
Yeah, the shoes and nothing is impossible. Everywhere you saw this. What does that mean? It does not mean, of course. Then I do this with my students. What Parmenides means by nothing. It's the opposite, right? I mean, everything is possible. I mean, there is no limit in the sense. No, I mean, it's interesting.
Going to the cat club, huh? Yeah.
That's the way in which we usually use the sentence.
Right.
Yeah. But in the sense of Parmenides, it is precisely that it is, as he says, we cannot speak of it, we cannot think of it, and so on. Okay. So, but in any case, he continues and he says, though he was bound to deny all motion of the sphere itself, but such an admission would not have served to explain anything. If any part of the sphere were to move, which is, again, it's not that one part of the sphere moves not by itself. Actually, this is then something that will come back with the combination ontology in Anaxagoras. It's not right, but it is the whole. The room of the displaced body must at once be taken by other body, for there is no empty space. This, however, would be of precisely the same kind as the body it had displaced. right? Which is again the idea of this constant, no, and infinite expansion. I mean that it is again. It's not that there is a place in which, right, the place would be also, according to Zeno, something that exists, pre-exists, right? It's not that you move into that, but it is this self-rounding movement, right? I mean, where time and space become really this progressive making of what is and what on the basis of what can be. And I don't remember, probably I misspoke the other day when I remember that I mentioned Nishida, Kitaro. I don't remember if I said, because I haven't watched if I misspoke, I had to correct. When I spoke about continuity and discontinuity, what I meant to say is that that I wrote a book today. He speaks of this mediation of the continuity of a discontinuity. Okay, so it's not that there is this play between continuity and discontinuity. This is the book, great book, right? The mediation of the continuity or discontinuity, whereby these movements, ontological unrest, ontological movement keeps going, not because it occupies any other space other than to speak the language of Parmenides, other than the sphere itself, but it is it itself that precisely keeps being what it is, because on the basis of what it can be, potentiality. Again, we should emphasize that concept and that reality. So this, however, would be, I'm reading again from Bruno, would be of precisely the same kind as the body. It can displace, right? For all there is one. Okay. So again, we are back to the question of potentiality, and we are back to the question of also Heraclitus, or at least even the way in which then Parmenides takes issue with Heraclitus, those who speak about being the same and not the same, and so on. But it is the result of the motion, this is Bruno continuing, right, would be precisely the same as that of rest. It could account for no change. Okay, but in any case, he allows for this possibility of motion, ultimately. And then he goes into the question of uses. He speaks about uses as precisely, as we know, the self-arising and therefore, right, I mean, whose dynamic movement, this unrest, this motion not be confused, is also unrest, right? The same as Pelin, so it is on the basis of potentiality of what can be. Okay, so in any case, we have seen, this fragment 4 in the booklet, okay, and the comment. This is on from page 205, and the comment by booklet on page 227. But I read now from the second part of this fragment, which is also, if you want to look at the curve, is fragment 35 and fragment 36. It's two fragments on page 81. So go to now, consider with all your powers in what way each thing is clear. And then he ends by saying, but consider everything in the way it is clear. And we know again that the way to do so is by, again, recuperating the senses and the world we are, right? That's the problem that otherwise we may encounter with Parmenides. Because again, for Parmenides, that would be only the cycle of appearance, the world of appearance, right? And not of the true essence. So then we had the four roots of all things. I mean, we can speak about that, and here what we saw earlier in remember, Gerd, there is no nature. Nature is actually the word he uses here, Brunet, is substance. There is no substance, and then same idea, right? I mean, that the substance is but a name given to these things by man. And he says there is no substance of any of all the things. This is page 205 and 206. Again, there is no substance of any of all the things that perish, nor any cessation for them of being through death. There are only a mingling and interchange of what has been mingled. Substance is but a name given to these things by man, but the word that he translates with substance here, as he says in a footnote, is fusis. Okay, so which is then usually
Nature.
nature. So then in Kurt we have nature. I mean, we know then what Heidegger says it's the right. I mean, he says fusis, which is birth, which we often not mention the Heideggerian rendering of it beautiful as the self-arising, but it's the same. It's fusis. But again, I mean, what we see as the combination of ontology and Anaxagoras maybe will be even more. Importantly so, right, a matter of combination, but it's already here, right, the mingling and the not only that, and the interchange, the mingling and the interchange of the four roots, the causes, the roots in Empedocles, and then the homo e homoerei in the seeds and the stuff in the homogeneous stuff in Anaxagoras, but it is also then it becomes even more apparent that it is precisely that there is this moment of eternity, right, that we saw in Parmenides, but that there is also what what today has become, kind of relatively, known, popular, the concept of trans-individuality, or what I prefer, trans-individuality, right? Because what we see both in Empedocles, right, with this mingling and interchanging, and then what then Anaxagoras makes very explicit as saying, there is no coming to be or passing away. It's only, again, precisely a combination of things that come together, then they fall apart, and then they come together again, combination, recombination, which is precisely the idea that it is, whatever reality we consider is ultimately the result of a process of many individuals, coming together in a trans-individual type of relation, right? And this is what then is what we see, and so on and so forth, right? The visible, behind which, as I will find the quote in a moment, the fragment, there is the invisible, right? The visible and the invisible become also important in, I believe, Anaxagoras. But I'll go back to the question of the trans-individual type of relation, but this is still, if I may now read this very short fragment from Bonnet on Anaxagoras on page 261, fragment 21a, that again, calls, that highlights the relation between Anaxagoras and Parmenides, right? He says, what appears is a vision of the unseen. Right, what appears is a vision of the unseen. We can talk more about this, but it's certainly very important, right? And again, the play between the visible and invisible, or the cycle of appearance, the whatever we may call the essence, or also the idea of this coming together, the gathering, right, at the threshold of the many individuals that then make up the trans-individual, that I prefer to trans-individual realities, right? We can use that word, realities, various realities, and so on, okay? beyond which, of course, there is always that's what appears, and it is always the vision of the unseen, which is carried with it. Right. And at this point, I also want to make another remark on the question of even the title, no, of this second series of the seminars, right? I mean, what is not. And when we spoke about Anaxagoras and how he makes more explicit, I mean, he again takes issue with the language that the philosophers before him used, because again, I repeat, no one ever said, things come from nothing, go back into nothing. That's a no, so to speak, in a Presocratic philosophy, of course, right? But of course, we have this idea of, for example, in Heraclitus, I mean, we are and we are not. We step into and we do not step into. It will come back again with the atomists. But again, we should consider that it is, we will see this again, so to speak, this idea of relative nothing, right? We saw that in last time also with a relation to Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, right? What is based on right, what is not. So it's the same idea. So it is in this context that we can understand also this idea that what appears is a vision of the unseen, that it is carried within, not as a pure and absolute negation, but still not part of the same potentiality and contingency, which also includes the potentiality not to, right? I mean, which includes what we saw with Leibniz ultimately. I mean, not all possible things can exist, right? Because they will get into each other's way, right? So, I mean, there are some things that remain unseen, but that doesn't mean that they are not. They all are. That's the point. And that's the point that is made by both Empedocles and Anaxagoras in different ways, right? And okay, so we saw this again both in the curve and in Burnett. This is now fragment 8 in Burnett. Again, that there is no substance, there is no nature, there is no fuses, right? But only a mingling and interchanging, which is again this is. But again, I hope that this is clear how the more, I mean, as simple as this is, right? But, I mean, very simple. But it is what we saw at the beginning, no?
Oh, yeah.
Right, I mean, but that's what it is, the cycle of appearance, right? The vision, right? What appears is a vision of the unseen. It is, again, we use this when we spoke already what Aristotle says, the accomplices of Thales, I mean, something, the attributes remaining, but, I mean, the substance remaining, but changing in its attributes, right? But even more so with Anaximander, right? The things that are perish into those from which they came to be, and so on. There is no other explanation but this of the cycle, which is again beautifully rendered now by Anaxagoras, by Democritus already with the mingling and interchanging, and then even more so by Anaxagoras. And this is, there is another fragment in which apparently, there is this kind of issue that he takes with Parmenides, page 207, 11, 12. So this is why, in a sense, it sounds kind of unfair and redacted the way in which Hegel deals with Empedocles. There is much more, right? So he says, fools, for they have no far-reaching thoughts, who deem that what before was not comes into being, or that all can perish and be utterly destroyed. For it cannot be that whatever can arise from what in no way is, and it is impossible and unheard of that what is should perish, for it will always be wherever one may keep putting it, right? So much similarity actually between Empedocles and Anaxagoras, and of course Anaxagoras then we will have to deal also with the question of nous. I mean, great, of course, they're very important, right? Hegel highlights that in important ways, Burnett also, and that nous also, lends itself, to put it this way, to an elaboration on themes of the contemporary relevance of Presocratic philosophy. I mean, in many ways, right? We can, because I know how much time we have, we can touch on that as well. But one thing, I just make a quick suggestion. Then we can go back to this: the general intellects in Marx, right? Or also today we know in the digitalized type of society and the surveillance machinery and the
general intellect would incorporate that, wouldn't it? Still,
yeah.
I mean, as a concept, the general intellect actually can subsume the surveillance,
absolutely,
capitalism, data-driven stuff.
Absolutely.
He understood this very well. I mean, that's something that was really anticipated.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is, it's very interesting. We can go back to that as well. And although in Anaxagoras there is this nous regulating everything, but then also that there is a relation to human consciousness. I mean, and the only thing there too, almost like the sphere in Parmenides, in a sense, it's a different thing, but the question that everything is mingled and interchanged together in Anaxagoras too, but not nous, although there are things that contain, relate to nous as well. Okay, so maybe we can move into Anaxagoras proper, although I called attention here and there to maybe one thing that I want to mention in Empedocles, because we saw the fragment 105, right to 20, page 220, the blood brown, the heart is the thought of man. On page 221, fragment 109 says, for it is with earth that we see earth, water with water, and water with water. By air we see bright air, by fire destroying fire. By love do we see love, and hate by grievous hate. Okay, and then the comment by Burnett is very interesting on page 248, right? 48, he says perception, that's the question. Perception then is due to the meeting of an element in us with the same element outside. But this is again the importance, the emphasis on the senses, and in a sense, because we read that passage by Marx, I thought that the relation is obvious there too, right? I mean. Okay, we saw this. Of course, Burnett explains that love and strife in Empedocles, they are not incorporeal forces. Of course, they are bodily things, forces, precisely not things. And he also says on page 249, this is actually, he is making a reference to, he's referring to Theophrastus, for whom Empedocles made no difference between distinction between thought and perception, which is, again, so much for not what Hegel says, it's more poetry than philosophy, but that's what it is, right? I mean, the blood around the heart, right? That's human thought and not any other thing, right? So we can... So then to move to Anaximenes, Anaximander proper, but Anaxagoras, right? We saw many already references, we made references, and Anaximenes came to mind because there is a relation between Anaxagoras and Anaximenes that we already brought up last time, or the time before that, when I believe Chris made the point, asked the question that right about the question of the relation between nous and human consciousness and so on. And we read that fragment from Anaximenes where he says something similar, right? The whole cosmos breathes, but it is the same type of breath, ultimately, right? So, but apparently, Anaxagoras started by teaching Anaximenes. Okay, Anaxagoras comes from the same region, same area in Anatolia, in what today is Turkey, close to Izmir. The city he comes from is close to Miletus, where Thelis, Anaximander, and Anaximenes come from, Ephesus, from where Heraclitus comes from. It is actually today, Klazomenai is inside a city called Urla, which I went to many years ago when I was in Turkey. I mean, it's not maybe 1 hour from Izmir. But in any case, then he's the first philosopher that we find in Athens, right? Although he's not from Athens. And just like Socrates, he is also prosecuted for similar charges, right, of impiety, and then he goes away. I mean, unlike Socrates, he leaves, he goes back to that area of, Anatolia, and stays there. But so he starts, there is a relation to Anaximenes. And then, of course, I mean, to the others, as we saw, the fragment of Anaximander is very close to what he also says. And some of the fragments, we saw some of them, but there are others, right? For example, on page 258, fragment 1, all things were together infinite, both in number and in smallness, for the small too was infinite. Right, well, we spoke already about this in a sense, because there is a relation to Zeno.
Yeah, the divisions.
Yeah, exactly. And then in another next fragment, even more clearly so, right? And so the infinitely small, just the infinitely, we spoke about it. So, and
by the way, it plays beautifully in a poem by Odysseus Laertius. On the beauty of Odysseus Laertius, a great Greek poet who won the Nobel Prize, and the axiom esti, the axioms that are, the axioms to be, in this poem, which is a very didactic poem, but it's very interesting. He actually takes this up in terms of the smallness and the infinite. It's very beautiful in the beginning. And there's refrains that really work off of this. So it's a kind of rewriting, if you will, of Anaxagoras.
Anaxagoras in particular. That's interesting. Yeah, but he's very interesting. And
since we're talking about poetry, the modern Greek poets are very well aware of the Presocratics, very much so. I mean, he's one of the ones that is closest outside the epic form of Homer into more of the Presocratics, unlike Cetheris is much more in the epic tradition, with Homeric hymns and the Homeric epic.
Who came from, they say, the same area.
Yes, right, exactly.
But I want to read this also
Yeah.
because I don't know how much time it will
Well, about
we can-
5 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
then
yeah.
we can go back to Anaxagoras next time, the
Mhm.
last time, and then do not the
The
Atomists and
we're doing the
Sophists.
sophists?
And the
Okay.
Atomists, yeah.
Okay.
But this one,
That's a lot, Bruno.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's not.
Gives us 2 weeks though to read.
Right,
Till
yeah.
the 25th.
So this one, fragment 3, page 258 in the Bruno rendering of the fragments, nor is there a list of what is small. But there is always a smaller, and this is precisely not the relation to Zeno, for it cannot be that what is should cease to be by being cut. I mean, again, Parmenides, Zeno, carried, into the, continued, the elaboration by Anaxagoras as Empedocles already did. But there is also always something greater than what is great. So same idea. And here too, we see, because the question of the small is wonderful, the infinitely small, the infinite. That's again the idea that the sphere cannot be limited, right? Because there is always something greater than what is great, right? And the question of potentiality, expansion,
Right.
and it is equal to the small in amount and compared with itself. Each thing is both great and small. And this is great in itself. Then he goes in the next fragment into the question of the seeds of all things. We go back to this next time, and then the comment by Bruno also. At one point he speaks of this multitude of innumerable seeds, which is again what ultimately accounts for the combination ontology that we have already in Empedocles in Anaxagoras too. Last time we spoke about the ontology of convergence,
Right.
and so I mean this is also interesting, but we can go back to that as well. And maybe we go back to Anaxagoras next time and then continue.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Heidegger always, I think he tells the story in multiple lectures, but how if you break a piece of chalk into finer and finer pieces, know more about what the chalk is.
Yeah, the particle don't do
And
anything.
who
Heidegger.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he does it in What is the Thing, and probably in other ones too. I think I've heard at least twice.
The thing. He has one.
No,
the
that's
thing.
just
What is the
dusting.
thing?
Yeah,
Right.
that's it. What is the thing?
Ah,
Or
yes,
Lacan.
okay, I'll check it,
Yeah,
yeah.
not dusting. Yeah, dusting is the Lacan.
Yeah, that's great.
The Freudian
But,
thing,
Yeah,
yeah,
what is the thing? Okay.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite ones.
Oh yeah. And the thing also.
Yeah.
The thing things. No, that's what he says.
The world worlds.
The thing, the world worlds.
That's right.
But the question is, right, that I was thinking, nothing cannot even nothing.
Right.
True.